Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're starting something new. This is volume 1 of a series of stories that are honestly some of the most disturbing and unsettling ones I've come across. Each volume will bring a different story that starts off feeling normal, but slowly turns into something much darker and harder to explain. The story you're about to hear comes from someone who spent many years working in a hospital maternity ward. After decades in that job, they believed they had seen just about everything that could happen in a delivery room. But one night, a heavily pregnant woman walked into the hospital with no identification, no medical records, and no explanation for where she came from. At first, it seemed like a normal late-night delivery. But what started happening after that night quickly turned into something that made absolutely no sense. And by the end of it, the person telling this story began to question everything they thought they understood about reality. Also, if you guys have your own strange, creepy, or disturbing stories you'd like to share, feel free to send them in. I always enjoy reading your stories, and some of them may even appear in future volumes on this channel. And before we start, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now and what time is it for you? Let me know down in the comments. I love seeing where you guys are watching from. So set your headphones, grab some snacks, sit back and enjoy. Let's get into tonight's story. I worked 28 years as a midwife. This is the most horrifying thing I ever experienced. Ever since I was a child, I had always been fascinated by the moment a new life enters the world. While most kids talked about becoming singers, athletes, or astronauts, my dream was different. I wanted to work in a maternity ward. I wanted to be there when babies took their first breath and parents met their children for the first time. Something about that moment always felt powerful to me, almost magical, like witnessing the very beginning of a story that would last an entire lifetime. Years later, after finishing my medical training, I finally became a midwife at a busy city hospital. The job was exhausting. The shifts were long, especially the night shifts, and the emotional pressure could be intense. Some nights were filled with laughter and celebration as families welcomed healthy babies into the world. Other nights were chaotic and frightening, with doctors rushing through the halls and nurses trying desperately to stabilize difficult deliveries. But even during the hardest moments, I never regretted choosing this career. After working in the maternity ward for more than 20 years, very little surprised me anymore. I had seen complicated births, emergency surgeries, and situations that would make most people panic. Experience teaches you to stay calm under pressure. It teaches you that no matter how strange something looks at first, there is usually a medical explanation behind it. At least, that's what I believed before the night everything changed. It was a quiet night shift, the kind that makes the hospital feel almost peaceful. Most of the lights in the hallway were dimmed, and the only sounds were the faint hum of medical machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses moving between rooms. I was sitting at the nurse's station finishing paperwork when the automatic doors at the end of the ward slowly slid open. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It was common for patients to arrive late at night when labor suddenly started, but after a moment I noticed someone standing in the hallway. It was a woman. She was heavily pregnant and holding her stomach with one hand as she slowly walked toward the desk. The fluorescent lights above made her skin look extremely pale, almost gray. She wore an oversized hoodie and loose sweatpants that looked old and worn, like she had been traveling for a long time without rest. Her dark hair hung messily around her face and her eyes were red and tired as if she hadn't slept in days. Something about the way she moved made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just exhaustion. There was something else about her that I couldn't explain. When she reached the desk, she slowly lifted her head and looked directly at me. "My name is Lena," she said quietly. Her voice sounded dry and distant, like someone who hadn't spoken to another person in a long time. I asked for her identification and medical information, but she slowly shook her head. I don't have anything with me, she replied. That wasn't completely unusual. Sometimes women arrived at the hospital in a rush without documents when labor started suddenly. Still, something about the situation felt off. Her stomach looked unusually large, even for someone close to giving birth. The skin stretched tightly across it as if something inside was pressing outward. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface of her skin. I blinked and the movement was gone. Trying to ignore the strange feeling building in my chest, I called over the doctor on duty that night, Dr. Harris. He had been working at the hospital for years and was known for staying calm even during difficult deliveries. He examined the woman while I prepared the monitoring equipment. After a short moment, he nodded. She's 5 centimeters dilated, he said. We need to admit her right away. That meant the baby was coming soon. So we helped Lena into one of the delivery rooms and began preparing everything for the birth. At that moment, none of us realized that her arrival would lead to the most disturbing experience of my entire career. We helped Lena onto the delivery bed and began preparing the equipment for the birth. I attached the fetal monitor to her stomach while Dr. Harris checked her pulse and blood pressure. The machine started its steady rhythm, printing the baby's heartbeat across the screen. Everything appeared perfectly normal. The baby's heart rate was strong and steady, and Lena's vitals showed no signs of distress. But Lena herself was strangely calm. Most women in labor react to the pain in some way. They cry, breathe heavily, squeeze someone's hand, or ask for medication when the contractions grow stronger. Lena did none of that. She simply lay on the bed staring up at the ceiling, completely silent as if she were somewhere far away. I tried speaking with her to make the situation feel less uncomfortable. Is this your first baby? I asked. Slowly, she turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes felt strangely focused, almost too focused, like she was studying me instead of answering my question. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she quietly replied, yes. That was all. After that, she turned her head back toward the ceiling and remained silent. The room became unusually quiet. The only sounds were the soft beeping of the monitoring machines and the faint hum of the hospital ventilation system. Dr. Harris continued checking her progress while I prepared the delivery instruments we would soon need. Hours passed slowly as the labor progressed. Then suddenly, without warning, Lena's body went rigid. Her back arched violently off the bed, and her hands clenched tightly at her sides. A strange choking sound escaped her throat as her eyes rolled upward until only the whites were visible. Doctor, I called out. Dr. Harris rushed to the bedside, but what caught my attention wasn't just her reaction. It was her stomach. The veins across her belly suddenly became visible beneath the skin. At first I assumed it was simply the strain from the contraction, but then I realized something was wrong. The veins weren't pulsing normally. They were moving. Slowly shifting beneath her skin, twisting across her stomach like something alive was pushing against them from the inside. For a moment, the dark lines formed a strange shape that I couldn't quite understand. Dr. Harris stared at her stomach with the same confusion. What the hell is that? He muttered. But before either of us could react further, Lena's body suddenly relaxed again. Her back dropped back onto the bed and her eyes slowly returned to normal. The veins faded beneath her skin as if nothing unusual had happened. The monitors continued beeping calmly. The baby's heartbeat was steady. Lena took a slow breath as if the entire episode had never happened. Dr. Harris checked her vitals again, then shook his head slightly. Probably just a muscle spasm, he said, though he didn't sound completely convinced. I nodded, but deep down something about the situation didn't feel right. The labor continued normally after that. Then, when the clock on the wall reached 2:45 in the morning, Lena suddenly pushed. Within minutes, the baby was born. The delivery itself was smooth and uncomplicated. A healthy newborn cried loudly as soon as it entered the world, filling the quiet room with that familiar sound I had heard hundreds of times before. Normally, that sound brought relief. But for some reason, that night it made the room feel colder. We cleaned the baby and performed the usual checks right there in the delivery room. Everything looked perfectly normal. The baby's breathing was strong, its heartbeat steady, and there were no visible problems. After making sure everything was stable, I stepped out of the room for a moment to log the birth into the hospital system at the nurse's station. It only took a few minutes. But when I returned to the delivery room, the bed was empty. The baby was gone. And Lena had disappeared. When I walked back into the delivery room, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Just minutes earlier, the newborn baby had been crying loudly, filling the room with that familiar sound I had heard hundreds of times before. Now the room felt strangely empty. The bed sheets were still messy from the delivery, but Lena was gone. The baby was gone too. At first I assumed Dr. Harris must have moved them to another room while I was at the nurse's station. That was the only explanation that made sense. I stepped back into the hallway and quickly looked around, expecting to see a nurse pushing the baby toward the nursery or Lena being taken to recovery. But the hallway was completely normal. When I asked Dr. Harris where the patient from room 3 had gone, he looked at me with confusion. He asked me what patient I was talking about. When I told him about Lena and the baby we had just delivered, his expression slowly changed from confusion to concern. He told me room 3 had been empty all night. My stomach tightened as I rushed to the computer and opened the hospital system to check the delivery record I had entered just minutes earlier. But when the screen loaded, the record was gone. There was no patient named Lena, no delivery at 2:45, and no record that a baby had been born. It was as if the entire event had never happened. For the rest of that shift, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I kept telling myself there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe I had entered the record incorrectly. Maybe Lena had given a fake name and someone had moved her without telling me. But deep down, none of those explanations felt right. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I had simply been too tired. Working long night shifts can mess with your head, and the maternity ward had been busy that week. Eventually, the memory started to feel distant, like a strange dream that didn't quite make sense. Then exactly 1 week later, during another night shift, the maternity ward doors opened again. I looked up from the nurse's station and immediately felt my stomach drop. Walking slowly through the hallway was the same woman, the same pale skin, the same tired eyes, and the same worn hoodie. And just like before, she was heavily pregnant. When she reached the desk, she looked directly at me and spoke in the same quiet voice. "My name is Lena," she said. In that moment, I knew I hadn't imagined anything the week before. Because somehow, impossibly, the same woman who had already given birth was standing in front of me again. For a moment I just stared at her, trying to convince myself that it had to be someone else. But the more I looked at her face, the more certain I became. It was the same woman. The same pale skin, the same tired red eyes, and the same quiet expression that made the room feel strangely cold. I quickly called Dr. Harris over and told him that the woman had been here the week before. I reminded him about the delivery, about the baby, and about how she had disappeared afterward. But he simply gave me the same confused look as before and told me that no such patient had ever been admitted. When he examined her, he said the exact same words I remembered from the previous week. She was 5 centimeters dilated and already in active labor. Hearing that made my stomach tighten because it felt like the entire situation was repeating itself. We helped Lena into the same delivery room again. Everything inside the room looked exactly the same as it had the week before. The same machines, the same bed, and the same quiet atmosphere. It felt less like a new night, and more like I had stepped back into the same moment all over again. And deep down, I had the terrible feeling that this night was going to end exactly the same way. As the hours passed, everything unfolded exactly the way it had the week before. Lena lay quietly on the delivery bed, staring at the ceiling with that same strange, calm expression. The monitors showed a healthy heartbeat for the baby, and her vitals were perfectly normal. To everyone else in the room, it looked like an ordinary delivery. But I knew better. When the contractions became stronger, Lena's body suddenly stiffened just like before. Her back arched off the bed, her hands clenched tightly, and her eyes rolled upward until only the whites were visible. I watched closely this time, already knowing what I was about to see. The veins across her stomach slowly rose beneath her skin. They twisted and stretched across her belly like dark lines moving under the surface. For a moment they formed a strange pattern, a circle with a square inside it, the same mark I had noticed during the first delivery. Then, just as suddenly as before, Lena's body relaxed again. A few minutes later, at exactly 2:45 in the morning, she gave birth. The baby looked perfectly healthy, crying loudly as we wrapped it in a blanket. Everything seemed completely normal, but this time I didn't leave the room. I stayed there watching Lena carefully, determined not to let her disappear again. For several minutes after the delivery, Lena simply lay there holding the baby in her arms. The newborn had stopped crying and rested quietly against her chest, wrapped tightly in the hospital blanket. The room felt unusually still, and the only sound was the faint beeping of the monitoring machine beside the bed. Dr. Harris eventually stepped out of the room to answer a call from another department. That left just Lena and me inside the delivery room. I pretended to check the equipment while keeping my eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. Slowly, Lena sat up. The movement immediately caught my attention. A woman who had just given birth should barely be able to move without help. But Lena stood up from the bed easily, as if the delivery had not affected her at all. She adjusted the blanket around the baby and walked calmly toward the door. Before leaving, she paused and looked directly at me. For a moment neither of us spoke, then a faint smile appeared on her face. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the kind of smile that made my stomach tighten with unease. "You're starting to notice," she said quietly before opening the door and stepping into the hallway. For a moment I stood there frozen, unsure if I should stop her or call someone. But something about the way she spoke made my curiosity stronger than my fear. I stepped into the hallway just in time to see her walking toward the hospital exit, the newborn still wrapped quietly in her arms. She moved quickly but calmly, passing the nurse's station without anyone paying attention to her. It was strange. A woman who had just given birth should have drawn attention immediately, but the staff around us acted as if she wasn't even there. It was like they simply couldn't see her. I followed her outside into the cold night air. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by a few dim streetlights. Lena walked across the pavement without hesitation and crossed the street toward the darker part of the city where the old industrial buildings stood abandoned. I kept my distance as I followed her through the quiet streets. After several minutes, she finally stopped in front of a large, rusted warehouse. The heavy metal door was slightly open. She paused for a moment, then slowly turned her head and looked directly at me as if she had known I was behind her the entire time. "They've been waiting for you," she said softly before stepping inside the dark building. For a few seconds I stood outside the warehouse door, staring into the darkness where Lena had disappeared. The night around me was completely silent, and the old building looked like it had been abandoned for years. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around and go back to the hospital. But something strange was happening. The fear I had felt moments earlier slowly began to fade, replaced by a powerful curiosity. It felt almost like a pull, like something inside that warehouse wanted me to come closer. Before I could change my mind, I stepped through the open door. The air inside was thick and damp. A faint fog covered the floor, slowly swirling around my feet as I walked deeper into the building. The huge warehouse was almost completely dark, but somewhere inside the mist I could see a faint green glow moving slowly. Then I saw it. Several long, glowing shapes were moving through the fog. They looked like massive tentacles, their surfaces shining with a strange green light. As one of them moved closer, I noticed a familiar symbol on its tip. A circle. And inside the circle, a square. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind struggled to understand what I was seeing as the glowing shapes slowly moved through the fog toward me. The tentacles shifted gently in the air, almost like they were studying me. One of them slowly reached forward and touched my arm. The moment it made contact, a wave of images flooded my mind. I saw endless stars, distant planets, and strange cities that could not possibly exist on Earth. It felt like someone had opened a door inside my head and poured thousands of memories into it at once. And suddenly I understood. They had come to Earth to hide. Their species was being hunted across the galaxy, and only a few of them had survived. Earth was the only place where they could remain safe, hidden inside human bodies where no one from outside could touch them. The pregnancies, the strange births, the disappearing babies, it was all part of their plan to survive. When the light in my mind finally faded, I found myself standing somewhere else. The fog and the warehouse were gone. Instead, I was standing in a familiar hallway under bright hospital lights. It was the maternity ward. I looked down at my body and my breath caught in my throat. My stomach was swollen. I was pregnant. Footsteps approached behind me and a nurse's voice spoke gently. "Can I help you?" she asked. I slowly turned my head. For a moment, I didn't answer. Then I heard my own voice say quietly, "My name is Lena." And just like that, everything started again. That moment stayed in my head long after the story ended. The idea that it never really stops, that it just keeps repeating, is what makes it so unsettling. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to drop a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next volumes in this series. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was really happening here, and where are you listening from right now? Let me know down in the comments. And if you have your own creepy or disturbing story, feel free to share it. Some of your stories might be featured in future videos. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.